Hey guys, so today's lesson, we're going to continue building on what we talked about yesterday with how energy moves through different ecosystems. One of the things we're going to be looking at today is something called energy pyramids, which is another way of representing that movement of energy. And then we're also going to look at two other types of pyramids as well. So this lesson, like I said, we're going to be talking about energy. One of the things we're going to be talking about is the amount of energy that is lost as it moves from one trophic level to another. And then, like I said, we're also going to be looking at some things called pyramids. So the first thing that you need to be able to do is talk about the first and second law of thermodynamics in terms of how energy moves through different ecosystems. Then we're going to look at why energy is lost during this process. We're also going to do some calculations around that. And then we're going to look at the pyramid of numbers, pyramid of energy, and pyramid of biomass. You do need to be able to interpret and draw those different types of ecological pyramids. And then lastly, you need to know essentially what would cause an irregular pyramid to occur. So energy enters the biosphere in the form of solar radiation. That is kind of the initial or the primary source of all energy in the biosphere, is energy that comes from the sun. That energy is then stored in autotrophs or producers. Once they convert that solar energy into chemical energy, which is stored in the bonds of their glucose molecules. They do that through photosynthesis. That energy that can then be passed on from the autotrophs to the primary consumers anytime those primary consumers eat the autotrophs. And then anytime a secondary consumer eats a primary consumer, that energy would get passed on again, and it would just keep moving up the different trophic levels. But the amount of energy available decreases as you move up the different trophic levels. So not all of the energy in an autotroph would get passed on to a primary consumer, and then not all of that energy in the primary consumer would get passed on to the secondary consumer, and so on. That has to do with thermodynamics. So every time energy is transferred from one trophic level to the next, the amount of available energy is reduced. According to the first law of thermodynamics, energy cannot be created or destroyed. It only changes from one form to another. So for example, when we go from solar energy to chemical energy, that is energy changing from one form to another, but that energy can't just disappear, and you can't just make new energy from nothing. So we know that we're losing energy as you move up trophic levels, but it can't just be completely disappearing. It must just be getting converted into a form that's not usable to those organisms. The second law of thermodynamics says that during energy transfer, some energy is always converted into unusable energy or wasted energy, usually thermal energy. And you might remember that from the grade 10 science physics lesson where we talked about like efficiency and the fact that anytime an energy transfer occurs, it can never be 100% efficient. There's always some of that wasted energy. And so that is true even when we're talking about energy being passed from one organism to the next as they're eaten and stuff like that. Some of that stored chemical energy, which is the useful energy, is not going to be passed on. During that energy transfer, a lot of the energy is lost as useless energy, usually thermal energy or heat that gets dissipated out to the environment. Cellular respiration is also a reason why not all of the energy gets passed on. So cellular respiration is essentially when organisms take glucose and convert it into ATP energy, which is the type of energy cells can actually use. The glucose is the energy that gets passed on from one trophic level to a next. That ATP can't get passed on. That ATP is used up by the cells to do different tasks. It's essentially converted into like work. So yeah, when a consumer eats, some of the energy is stored, Some of the energy is used to digest that food. Some of it is used in cellular respiration to make ATP. Some of it ends up in the waste or the feces, and then a lot of it is lost as thermal energy. So that's why we don't see the full amount of energy available in a trophic level getting passed on to the next trophic level. Energy loss at each trophic level results in decreased productivity at higher trophic levels. Productivity is the ability to do work, and if a trophic level has less energy, it has less ability to do work. Those decreases in productivity also tend to result in a decrease in biomass at higher trophic level. So decreased biomass along with the larger body size of like higher consumers or top predators tends to result in lower population densities at higher trophic levels. Essentially, like a large population of rabbits can't support that many predators or like wolves. So you wouldn't have the same number of wolves as you would of rabbits in an ecosystem. So we represent all of this using 3 ecological pyramids. One is the pyramid of energy, the next is the pyramid of biomass, and the last one is the pyramid of numbers. For these ecological pyramids, essentially they're just going to have like a horizontal section that represents a trophic level, and then as we move up to the next horizontal section, that is the next trophic level. So the bottom of the pyramid is our first trophic level, then the second trophic level, third, fourth, etc. The first trophic level is obviously always going to be the autotrophs. Then we would have the primary consumers, then secondary consumers, and then tertiary consumers. Most ecological pyramids are regular pyramids, which means they look like a normal pyramid that is largest on the bottom and then gets smaller as you move upwards. Though we can also have irregular pyramids where you might have like a smaller section and then a bigger section on top of it and stuff like that. We'll go through what causes that. So let's start with the pyramid of energy, which essentially shows how much energy is available at each trophic level. Again, most of the energy in a trophic level will not get passed on to the one above it. Most of it is going to be used up or lost as heat. Only about 10% of the energy available in trophic level actually gets passed on to the next trophic level. This is called the 10% rule. And that is going to be really important when we do some calculations about this. So because of all this, pyramids of energy are always regular pyramids because you're always going to have only 10% of the energy in a trophic level getting passed on. So you're always going to be getting less and less energy available as you move up that pyramid. Energy is measured in either calories or kilocalories or joules or kilojoules. And it's usually expressed as an area. So like, for example, joules per meter squared or something like that. You usually also represent this as a specific time of year because obviously there's like more available energy in plants during the summer than in the winter. So this is just an example of what this would look like. So here you have the large kind of base of this pyramid for the producers, and then a much smaller level to represent the primary consumers, smaller again for the secondary consumers, smaller again for the tertiary consumers. So this is a regular pyramid that's getting smaller as you go upwards. A pyramid of biomass essentially represents the amount of dry mass of living things in an ecosystem. That's what biomass is. It's how much do all the living things in an ecosystem weigh. The biomass is essentially a measure of stored energy because energy is stored as organic molecules. So the more stored energy you have, the more mass you would have. So yeah, once again, we are representing each trophic level as a section of the pyramid. In this case, instead of that section representing the amount of energy, it's representing the amount of biomass, but it's going to work the same way. The largest section will usually be the autotrophs at the bottom, and then usually, again, it's going to be a regular pyramid, though not always. Ecosystems that get more sunlight will have larger pyramids of biomass because they have more stored energy. That's not always the case, but if you think of, say, like the rainforest, which gets a lot of solar energy, has a lot of biomass compared to, say, like the tundra, which would have very little biomass and gets very little solar energy. That's kind of the comparison. So this would be a typical pyramid of biomass, again, largest at the bottom where the producers are, and then gets smaller as we go towards the top. And this might seem a little counterintuitive because if you look at this, like a snake is going to weigh more than a grasshopper. But when you take into account the fact that there's only 10 snakes and there are 1,000 grasshoppers or more in this ecosystem, the combined weight of all of the grasshoppers would be more than the combined weight of all of the snakes. That's what this is talking about. And then we have the pyramid of numbers, which show just the number of organisms at each trophic level, usually in terms of density. So like number of organisms per kilometer squared or per meter squared. This type of pyramid, once again, can be a regular pyramid. However, of the 3 different pyramids, this one is the one that is most likely to be irregular. So the pyramid of energy is always regular. The pyramid of biomass is usually regular, but in rare instances can be irregular. And then the pyramid of numbers, again, most likely out of the 3 to be irregular. And this is because if you have, say, a grassland ecosystem where the number of producers has to do with like the number of blades of grass, that would be a very large base. And then you would have like insects that eat it, and then birds that eat the insects, and you would end up with a fairly normal pyramid of numbers. As long as the predator or the consumer is larger in body size than whatever it's eating, you will have a normal pyramid of numbers. However, if you have very large organisms that are being eaten by things smaller than it, your pyramid of numbers will be irregular. So an example of this would be an ecosystem where the dominant plant species are very large trees. When you just count the trees and get their numbers, you might not have many, especially compared to if you're counting blades of grass in a grassland. You're obviously going to have fewer trees than you would blades of grass in a different ecosystem. So you would have a fairly small number of trees relatively, but those trees can support a wide number of like insects. So you would have a larger section of insects over top of a smaller section of trees. So that's true anytime your consumer is smaller in body size than the thing that it's eating, your pyramid will be irregular. So we'll look at another example of that in a moment. This would be what a regular pyramid of numbers would look like. So again, if we look at this example down here, where you've got 100,000 leaves being eaten by 10,000 caterpillars, by 100 blue tits, which is kind of bird, by one of whatever that bird of prey is. So in this case, like the caterpillar is smaller than the blue tit, which is smaller than the bird of prey. And so because of that, you have a normal pyramid of numbers. This is what an irregular pyramid of numbers would look like. So in this case, you have an oak tree, which is very, very large, being eaten by insects, which are very, very tiny. And so that has made the bottom of this pyramid irregular. You have a few trees being eaten by a lot of insects. And then the woodpecker is once again bigger than the insect, so that's why the top part of this is back to regular, back to a smaller chunk on top of a bigger chunk. So you do need to be able to recognize that if I gave you a food chain, you would have to be able to draw a likely pyramid of numbers or a pyramid of energy and stuff like that. We can also compare biomes by comparing their ecological pyramids. Biomes near the equator, like we talked about, tend to have more energy available to the autotrophs because there's more sunlight, so therefore more photosynthesis happening, which will give us larger bases on both our pyramids of energy and our pyramids of biomass. And then biomes with large autotrophs will have pyramids of numbers that are fairly small compared to normal pyramids of numbers. So again, this would just be comparing a grassland to a forest with a pyramid of numbers. So obviously you can have a lot of grass that then can feed fewer insects than the number of blades of grass. But if you have trees, you don't need as many trees to feed as many insects. So that is why we have an irregular pyramid of numbers with our temperate forest, because you don't need as many autotrophs if the autotrophs are bigger. Okay, so I'm going to switch over to my document cam now. I'll have to go back inside for that. And we're just going to go over an example of some of the calculations that you'll have to do in terms of this, as well as if you're given a food chain, how could you draw your pyramid of numbers or a pyramid of energy and stuff like that.
Okay, so for this example here, I have given you a food chain. So shrubs are eaten by insects, insects are eaten by frogs, the frogs are eaten by the otters, and then the otters are eaten by the protozoa, which is a type of parasite. So I'm going to use this food chain for a couple different things here. The first is going to be to sketch out a pyramid of energy. And we know right away that a pyramid of energy is always going to be a regular pyramid. So all I'm going to do is count up how many trophic levels I have. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then I'm just going to draw a pyramid with 5 trophic levels. And as long as it's a regular pyramid that goes from largest to smallest, then it's a good enough pyramid of energy for us to use. Now, if you were going to draw out a pyramid of numbers instead, this is where you would have to take into account the size of these different organisms. So because shrubs are fairly large, I'm going to start with a box that isn't very large. And then insects are much tinier than shrubs, which means I'm going to need more insects in order to eat the shrubs. So I'm actually going to get a much larger box for the trophic level of insects. Essentially, when it comes to pyramids of numbers, the smaller the organism, the larger its trophic level box is going to be. My frogs are then larger than the insects, so they get a smaller box. Otters are larger than frogs, so they get a smaller box. But then protozoa are bigger than otters, so they have to get, protozoa are smaller than otters, so they get a bigger box. Again, the smaller something is, the bigger its box. The protozoa parasites very tiny, therefore they get a larger box. So that might be the pyramid of numbers. It doesn't really matter like how large the protozoa box is compared to the insect box. We're really just comparing the things like directly above or below the boxes when we're talking about this sort of thing. Okay, the one other thing that you might have to do with a food chain is a calculation about the amount of energy based on the 10% rule. So let me kind of get that set up and then I'll walk you through how to do that. Okay, so once again, I'm going to be using the exact same food chain that we did our pyramids for. But in this case, I have told you that 345,000 joules of solar energy is available in the ecosystem, and the autotrophs use 7% of it. I want to know how much energy is available at the level of the tertiary consumer. So in a question like this, you'll always be given a food chain. Sometimes it'll be written out like this for you. Other times it will just be written verbally, like shrubs are eaten by insects, eaten by frogs, blah, blah, blah. You'll also always be given an amount of solar energy available. You'll be given a percentage of that energy that's used by the autotrophs or the producers, and then you'll be asked for the amount of energy available. I will either give you a specific type of consumer that I want you to find out how much energy they have available, or I will give you a specific trophic level, like the 4th trophic level or something like that. So let's walk through how you would solve a problem like this. The first thing that you need to do is figure out what 7% of this available solar energy is. So my step 1 is going to be, what is 7% of 345,000? In order to do that, we have to start by converting our 7% into a decimal, which just means that we divide it by 100 to get 0.07. Of always means multiply. So we're just going to be multiplying 0.07 times our amount of joules. And we get 24,150 joules. That is how much is actually available in our autotroph level. The next thing you might want to do, and it's entirely up to you, is draw out a pyramid of energy. So in this case, I would have my autotrophs, which I now know have that 24,150 joules of energy. Then I'm going to have my primary consumer, and then my secondary consumer, and then my tertiary consumer. And of course, this is my autotrophs here. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to figure out how much energy I have left over by the time it has moved from my autotroph level all the way up to the tertiary consumer level. And each time that happens, like we said, all that gets moved on is 10% of the energy. So we're just going to figure out what 10% of this value is, and that's going to be how much ends up in our primary consumers. Okay, so in order to do that, all we're going to do is take our amount of joules in our primary consumers. We are going to multiply it by 0.1, which is 10%, and that will get us how much is available in our primary consumers. So 24,150 times 0.1 is 2,415. Times it by 0.1 again, and get 241.5. Times it by 0.1 again, and get 24.15. Another way of doing this is just moving the decimal. So I know that I'm going up 1, 2, 3 spots. So I'm going to take my initial amount of joules available at my primary, or sorry, at my autotrophs, and move the decimal place 1, 2, 3 spots. And I would get 24.15 joules. So either way you want to do it, either by multiplying by 0.1 every time you move up a trophic level, or by just seeing how many trophic levels you're going to move and then moving to the decimal place that often. That is all you have to do. Again, just make sure that your very first step is figuring out what percent of the solar energy, or sorry, we know what percent of the solar energy is available, but figuring out how much of that is actually used in the primary why do I keep calling the primary consumer, in the autotroph level, and then doing the 10% rule from there. Okay, I think I'll give you one more example of this that I'll write out for you, and then we'll just take that up. Okay, so in this example, I have given you zooplankton, or eaten by krill, which are eaten by fish, which are eaten by sharks. I've then told you that the plankton takes in 3% of the 146,000 joules of solar energy available. I want to know how much energy is available to the secondary consumer. So pause here, see if you can figure it out, and then come back to the answer. Okay, so first step is, of course, figure out what 3% of our 146,000 joules is. So I do 0.03 times that amount, and it gives me 4,380 joules. I then just took my food chain here. This is my autotroph, which means this is my primary consumer, which means this is my secondary consumer. So the fish is the level that I'm trying to get to. I just said, okay, I'm going up 1, 2 trophic levels. So I'm going to take my 4,380, move the decimal place 1, 2 spots, and that gets me 43.8 joules. I could have also taken this amount and times it by 0.1 to move up to the next trophic level, which would have got me 438.0, and then times it by 0.1 again to move up to the next trophic level, which would get me 43.8 joules. So again, whichever way you prefer doing it, it's totally fine. Okay, that's it for today's lesson. Let me know if you have any questions.